In the dense old-growth forests of Washington Territory during the brutal winter of 1892, a catastrophic snowstorm buried a remote logging camp under 8 feet of accumulated snow in less than 48 hours. The weight was so immense that timber cabin roofs collapsed one by one throughout the night, the sharp crack of breaking beams echoing through the frozen darkness as panicked families fled into the storm. 15 structures failed completely, their walls buckling inward under thousands of pounds of compacted snow. Yet when dawn finally broke and survivors emerged to assess the devastation, they discovered something that defied every assumption they held about construction and survival. One dwelling remained completely intact, its entrance still accessible, smoke rising peacefully from a small chimney as though nothing unusual had occurred. It was the same structure the entire camp had mocked relentlessly for 8 months, a cabin built entirely beneath the massive root system of a 400-year-old Douglas fir tree. Constructed by a young lumber worker, everyone dismissed as foolish or insane. The man who'd created this impossible shelter was Samuel Cordell, a 32-year-old timber faller who'd spent 5 years working the ancient forests of the Pacific Northwest. While his fellow loggers lived in conventional raised cabins built from milled lumber, Sam had chosen to excavate his home directly under the spreading roots of the largest tree he could find, creating what neighbors derisively called Cordell's Cave, his root cellar house, or simply the mole hole. They laughed at his methods, predicted his death when winter rains saturated the soil and collapsed the roots onto him, and openly wagered on how many weeks before he abandoned his underground burrow for a proper timber structure. But when that apocalyptic snowstorm tested every building in the settlement, Sam's root-sheltered cabin demonstrated advantages none of them had considered, proving that working with nature's existing structures could outperform even the finest human engineering. Before we reveal how this extraordinary dwelling survived what destroyed everything else, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel. These forgotten frontier building techniques represent practical survival knowledge that saved lives in extreme conditions. Your subscription helps preserve these invaluable historical lessons while ensuring you never miss the remarkable true stories we continue uncovering. The logging camps of Washington Territory in the early 1890s existed in some of the most challenging wilderness conditions on the continent. Dense forests of Douglas fir, western red cedar, and Sitka spruce towered 200 feet overhead, creating a permanent twilight beneath their canopies even during midday. Winter temperatures regularly dropped below 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and Pacific storms dumped enormous quantities of rain and snow that could bury the landscape in days. Most lumber workers lived in hastily constructed cabins built from the very trees they harvested, raised structures with wooden floors elevated 3 feet above the muddy ground to prevent rot and allow drainage. These cabins followed a standard design: 4 walls of milled planks, a steeply pitched roof to shed rain and snow, a stone chimney, and minimal insulation beyond the wood itself. They were practical, quick to build, and adequate for survival, though barely comfortable during the harsh winter months when crews couldn't work and had to wait out storms. Samuel Cordell arrived at the camp in the spring of 1891 with more experience in these forests than most men twice his age. He'd started as a teenage camp helper, graduated to choker setter, then became a skilled faller, capable of dropping the massive old-growth giants with precision. But unlike many loggers who saw trees simply as board feet of lumber, Sam had developed a deep fascination with the forest ecosystem itself. During his years in the woods, he'd observed how fallen logs created shelter for countless animals, how bears denned beneath upturned root masses, how the indigenous Coast Salish peoples had historically used cedar bark and root structures for temporary shelters. He'd noticed that the largest trees created their own microenvironments, their massive root systems displacing tons of soil and forming natural cavities and overhangs beneath the trunk. One particular tree captured Sam's imagination completely. It stood near the edge of the logging camp's clearing, a Douglas fir of truly ancient proportions that the company foreman had ordered left standing as a spar tree for rigging operations. The trunk measured 8 feet in diameter at breast height, and Sam estimated the tree's age at 400 years or more based on similar specimens he'd seen felled. What fascinated him most was the root structure. The tree grew on a slight slope, and over centuries its roots had spread in an asymmetric pattern, the uphill roots diving deep for anchorage, while the downhill roots spread wide and created a remarkable formation. The massive root crown had lifted and displaced the soil around the trunk's base, creating a natural mound nearly 4 feet high on the downhill side. The roots themselves, some as thick as a man's torso, arched away from the trunk like the flying buttresses of a cathedral before diving back into the earth 15 feet from the tree's center. Standing beneath these roots one rainy afternoon, Sam had a revelation. The space under the root mass was already partially hollow, a natural cavity where centuries of root growth had created a dome-like structure overhead. The living roots formed a framework stronger than any timber construction humans could build, anchored to one of the most stable structures in the forest, supported by 4 centuries of growth. Why not build a cabin here, he thought, not between the roots, but directly beneath them, using the tree's own architecture as the primary structure. When Sam announced his intention to the camp foreman, Jacob Turner, the older man initially thought he was joking. "You want to dig a hole under that tree and call it a cabin?" Turner asked incredulously. "Son, the first big rain will soften that soil, and every one of those roots will come down on your head like a judge's gavel. You'll be buried alive." Sam tried to explain his reasoning. The tree had stood for 4 centuries through countless storms. Its roots were living structures, flexible yet incredibly strong, anchored deep into bedrock. The root mass would provide natural protection from wind, rain, and snow, while the earth itself would offer insulation superior to wooden walls. Turner shook his head. "I've been logging these woods 20 years and never heard such foolishness. You want to live like a badger in a burrow while there's perfectly good lumber all around? Build yourself a proper cabin like a civilized man, not some root cellar fit for storing potatoes." But Sam was determined. He'd saved his wages and could afford to build however he chose. The company owned the land, but allowed workers to construct personal dwellings wherever they wished, provided they didn't interfere with logging operations. The giant Douglas fir was staying regardless, protected as essential infrastructure, so building beneath it wouldn't create any conflicts. Sam began excavation in late spring when the ground had dried enough to work, but before summer heat made labor unbearable. He carefully examined the root structure, identifying the strongest overhead roots that would form his ceiling and the gaps between them where he could dig without damaging the tree's stability. The work was painstaking and methodical. Using a mattock and shovel, he excavated a space roughly 8 feet wide and 12 feet long, extending about 4 feet into the hillside beneath the uphill roots. He dug down approximately 3 feet below the natural ground level on the downhill side, creating a floor space with roughly 6.5 feet of headroom beneath the thickest roots. The root ceiling was irregular and organic, curving and dipping, but it was also remarkably solid. The main structural roots overhead ranged from 10 inches to nearly 2 feet in diameter, and Sam could see smaller feeder roots throughout, creating a dense network. He added only 4 timber support posts at strategic points, not because the roots needed help, but as psychological insurance and to provide attachment points for wall framing. For walls, Sam created a hybrid system. The uphill wall was simply the exposed earth face of the hillside, the tree's roots themselves forming most of the structure. He smoothed this surface and left it largely natural. The side walls and downhill wall he constructed from vertical logs, chinked with moss and clay, creating a barrier against wind and rain while leaving the root ceiling fully exposed inside. The entrance presented a unique challenge. The roots created natural curtain-like formations on the downhill side, and Sam built his door to fit within this existing framework. The doorway stood only 5 feet high, requiring anyone entering to duck slightly, but this low profile would help retain heat and reduce exposure to weather. For ventilation and heating, he constructed a small stone fireplace in one corner with a chimney that threaded carefully through a natural gap in the root structure. He'd observed that the roots had existing spaces between them where smaller roots had died and decomposed over the centuries, creating ready-made channels for smoke to escape. As Sam worked through the summer months, the camp's reaction evolved from amusement to open mockery. The crew began calling him Root Rat Cordell and Sam the Mole. Someone posted a hand-lettered sign on the Douglas fir's trunk reading, "Cordell's Cave, trespassers welcome, sanity not required." Jacob Turner's wife Clara represented the women's perspective on Sam's unusual dwelling. She arrived one afternoon with what she called a charity meal, though her tone dripped with condescension. "Poor boy," she said, peering into the dim interior. "Living in a hole like this. How will you ever attract a wife to such a place? No woman wants to live underground like a creature in a burrow." The younger loggers made it a running joke during lunch breaks. "Hey, Cordell, how's the basement treating you? Find any good worms down there? When the tree falls, we'll just leave you buried, save on funeral expenses." Sam endured the mockery quietly. He'd learned long ago that demonstration convinced skeptics far more effectively than argument. Let them laugh now, he thought. Winter would tell the true story. By late autumn, Sam had completed his root cabin. The interior was surprisingly spacious despite the low ceiling, the irregular root overhead creating an organic, cave-like atmosphere. He'd built a sleeping platform against the uphill wall, installed shelving using the natural curves of roots as supports, and created a small work area near the entrance where daylight penetrated through one small window he'd carefully positioned. The first heavy rains of November provided an initial test. Water poured from the sky for 3 days straight, the kind of sustained deluge that turned the forest floor into a quagmire and made logging operations impossible. Several conventional cabins developed leaks as rainwater found gaps in roof shingles and streamed down walls. Jacob Turner spent an entire afternoon on his roof in the rain, desperately trying to patch problem areas. Sam's root cabin, meanwhile, remained completely dry. The living tree above him was actively transpiring, pulling water up through its root system and releasing it through needles 70 feet overhead. The root mass itself, dense and interwoven, shed water like a thatched roof, channeling runoff away from the cavity beneath. The natural slope of the land meant water drained away from his entrance rather than pooling. When Turner grudgingly acknowledged that Sam had stayed dry, he dismissed it with a wave. Rain's one thing. Wait till winter snow piles up. All that weight will come down on those roots and crush you like a bug under a boot heel. You'll see. December brought the first significant snowfall, 6 inches accumulating overnight. The camp woke to a transformed landscape, trees draped in white, the usual sounds muffled by the snow blanket. Sam emerged from his root cabin to find several loggers watching expectantly, clearly hoping to see his structure compromised. Instead, they saw that the massive Douglas fir had caught most of the snow in its spreading canopy overhead. Time 0.3s. Some snow had filtered down to accumulate on the root mass, but the irregular surface meant it distributed unevenly, settling into gaps rather than loading any single root. More importantly, Sam's entrance remained completely clear. The overhang created by the root structure had prevented snow from blocking his doorway, while conventional cabins required inhabitants to shovel paths from their doors. The winter progressed with typical Pacific Northwest variability, periods of cold rain alternating with dry cold snaps and occasional snow. Sam's cabin proved remarkably comfortable throughout. The earth surrounding his dwelling maintained a relatively constant temperature around 45 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of surface conditions. His small fireplace needed only a modest fire to raise the interior to comfortable levels, and the thermal mass of the surrounding soil held that warmth for hours after the fire died. In contrast, the conventional timber cabins lost heat rapidly. Their wooden walls provided minimal insulation, and the elevated floor design meant cold air circulated freely underneath. Families burned enormous quantities of firewood trying to stay warm and still woke to frost forming on interior walls near the ceiling. Sam also discovered unexpected advantages he hadn't anticipated. The sound insulation was remarkable. The combination of earth and living wood muffling the howling wind that kept other cabins' inhabitants awake during storms. The air quality remained surprisingly fresh, the root system apparently allowing some gas exchange while the chimney provided active ventilation. And there was something psychologically comforting about the organic curves of the root ceiling, a sense of being protected within nature rather than isolated from it. Then came the storm that would change everything. In mid-January, a massive Pacific weather system stalled over the region, and the temperature dropped just enough that precipitation fell as snow rather than rain. It began snowing on a Tuesday evening, fat flakes drifting down steadily. By Wednesday morning, 8 inches covered the ground. By Wednesday evening, 2 feet, and the snow kept falling. The older loggers recognized the danger immediately. This wasn't typical Cascade snow that fell light and fluffy. This was heavy, wet snow, each inch weighing substantially more than normal, and it was accumulating faster than most of them had ever seen. By Thursday morning, 4 feet of snow blanketed the camp. Men struggled to dig out their doorways, and the sound of shovels scraping against wood filled the air. Several cabin roofs were visibly sagging under the load, the ridgelines dipping alarmingly in the middle. Jacob Turner organized crews to clear roofs, men climbing up with shovels to push snow off before the weight became critical. It was dangerous work, the footing treacherous, and the snow kept falling faster than they could remove it. That Thursday evening, the first cabin failed. The sound was unforgettable, a sharp crack like a rifle shot, followed by a groaning, splintering roar as the roof beam broke and the entire structure collapsed inward. The family inside had been eating dinner and barely escaped, stumbling out through a buckled wall as their home folded in on itself like a crushed box. Panic rippled through the camp. If one roof could fail, others would follow. The snow was now 5 feet deep and still falling. Families began evacuating to the camp's main lodge, a larger structure with a stronger roof, carrying whatever they could through waist-deep snow. The exodus continued through the night as 2 more cabins collapsed with thunderous crashes, their walls unable to withstand the inward pressure once the roof support failed. Jacob Turner gathered the crew in the lodge. "We've lost 3 cabins already, and that snow's got to be 6 feet deep by now. Anyone still in a private cabin needs to get here now before we lose more." Someone asked, "What about Cordell? He's still in that root hole?" Turner's expression darkened. "That fool! He's probably already buried. All that snow loading the tree, those roots will have given way hours ago. Probably crushed him in his sleep." But Clara Turner, standing near the window, suddenly pointed. "Jacob, look, smoke from his chimney." Everyone crowded to the windows. Through the heavy snowfall, barely visible, a thin stream of smoke rose from the vicinity of the great Douglas fir. "He's alive," someone murmured. "How is that possible?" Turner grabbed a coat. "I'm going to check. Man might be trapped, need help digging out." A group of 5 men struggled through the deep snow toward the Douglas fir. What they found defied everything they'd expected. Time, 05s. The massive tree stood like an island in the wide ocean, and the root mass beneath it had become something extraordinary. The roots had caught and distributed the enormous snow load across their entire curved structure, creating a dome of white overhead. The weight that would have crushed any man-made roof, easily 8 tons of compacted snow, rested harmlessly on roots that had evolved over 4 centuries to bear exactly such loads. Sam's doorway was completely clear. The root overhang had created a natural snow shed, preventing accumulation near the entrance. And from within came the warm glow of firelight. Turner knocked, feeling foolish for doing so. Sam opened the door, looking comfortable and completely unconcerned. "Evening, Mr. Turner," Sam said calmly. "Storm something, isn't it?" Turner stared past him into the cabin's interior. The root ceiling overhead showed no signs of stress whatsoever. The irregular wooden beams curved naturally overhead, just as they had for the past 400 years, utterly indifferent to the massive weight of snow they now supported. "Your cabin," Turner began, then stopped. "The snow, we thought." Sam nodded. "I know what you thought, but this tree has held more snow than this for centuries. The roots spread the load across maybe 400 square feet of contact with the ground. It's the strongest structure in this entire forest." One of the other men pushed forward. "3 cabins have collapsed. 15 families are packed into the lodge. And you're comfortable?" "More than comfortable," Sam admitted. "It's actually warmer in here than usual. All that snow overhead acts as extra insulation. I'm using less firewood than normal." The men stood in stunned silence. Everything they'd believed about proper construction, everything they'd mocked Sam for ignoring, had been wrong. Turner finally spoke, his voice quiet. "We've been fools, Cordell. Complete fools. You tried to tell us, and we laughed." By Friday morning, the snow had stopped, leaving nearly 8 feet of accumulation across the camp. In total, 7 conventional cabins had collapsed under the weight, and 4 more were so damaged they weren't safe to occupy. Only Sam's root cabin remained completely unaffected. The great Douglas fir had done what it had done for 4 centuries, stood firm against whatever nature delivered, its root system distributing loads that would crush lesser structures. The camp foreman called a meeting once the immediate crisis passed. "We're going to be rebuilding," he announced, "and we're going to do it smarter this time. Sam, I'm asking you to work with each family, help them find suitable trees, show them how you built your place." What followed was a remarkable transformation of the camp's architecture. Over the following months, Sam helped 7 families identify appropriate trees and construct root-sheltered cabins. Each was unique, adapted to the specific root structure of its chosen tree. Some used massive cedar stumps from previously logged giants, the root systems still alive and strong. Others found living Douglas firs or western hemlocks with suitable formations. The new dwellings weren't identical to Sam's. Some families created larger spaces by building between multiple root masses. Others combined root overhead protection with partial conventional walls. But all incorporated the fundamental principle that had saved Sam's life, using the forest's own strongest structures as the foundation rather than fighting against them. Clara Turner, who'd once pitied Sam for his hole in the ground, became one of the most enthusiastic converts. Her family's new cabin, built beneath the roots of a massive western red cedar, stayed remarkably cool during the following summer's heat. "I thought I'd hate living under roots," she admitted to Sam, "but it's like the tree is protecting us. I've never felt safer." The practical advantages became increasingly obvious with time. Root cabins required a fraction of the firewood conventional structures needed. They were naturally insulated against temperature extremes, cool in summer and warm in winter. The sound of wind and rain was muffled to a gentle whisper, rather than the roar that plagued timber cabins. And they were essentially indestructible, protected by living structures that had survived centuries of Pacific Northwest weather. Sam's personal vindication came not from the apologies or the recognition, though those were gratifying, but from a deeper satisfaction. He'd proven that observation of nature, respect for existing structures, and willingness to work with the forest, rather than simply extracting from it, could produce superior results. 2 years after building his root cabin, Sam married, and his wife loved the dwelling immediately. "It feels like living inside the tree itself," she said, "like we're part of the forest, not separate from it." They eventually expanded the cabin, carefully excavating additional space while respecting the root structure overhead. Sam added a second room, a small workshop area, and improved the ventilation system. But the fundamental design remained unchanged, a human dwelling sheltered beneath and integrated with one of nature's most perfect structures. Historical records from Washington Territory document the spread of root-sheltered construction techniques during this period, though the practice eventually faded as more conventional building materials became available and logging removed the ancient trees that made such construction possible. But the fundamental lessons Sam demonstrated remain valid. The strongest shelters sometimes come from working with existing natural structures rather than replacing them. Ancient trees represent engineering refined over centuries, capable of bearing loads and weathering conditions that challenge even modern construction. And true innovation often involves recognizing and adapting wisdom that already exists in the natural world. The great Douglas fir that sheltered Sam's cabin stood for another 60 years before finally succumbing to age and wind. When it fell, the root mass it left behind revealed the full extent of the system that had protected Sam through that catastrophic snowstorm. The roots extended over 20 feet in all directions, creating a network of support that had distributed countless tons of weight across hundreds of connection points with the earth. By then, Sam was an old man himself, but he visited the fallen giant one last time. He stood in the cavity where his cabin had been, now open to sky, and ran his hand along the massive roots that had formed his ceiling for so many years. "Thank you," he said quietly to the dead tree. "You taught me more than I taught anyone else." The story of Sam Cordell's root cabin spread beyond Washington Territory, inspiring a small movement of naturalistic builders who sought to integrate human dwellings with existing forest structures rather than clearing land completely. Some of these techniques persisted in various forms, influencing later concepts of sustainable architecture and biomimicry. But perhaps the most important lesson from Sam's experience wasn't about construction techniques at all. It was about humility in the face of nature's existing solutions, the willingness to learn from living systems, and the courage to pursue unconventional approaches despite mockery and doubt. When everyone else in the logging camp built upward, Sam built inward. When they relied on manufactured strength, he trusted ancient structures. When they fought against the forest, he worked within it. And when the catastrophic snowstorm arrived that would have crushed conventional thinking along with conventional cabins, Sam's root-sheltered dwelling stood firm, protected by 4 centuries of growth and the simple wisdom of recognizing that sometimes the best shelter isn't what we build ourselves, but what nature has already perfected. The mockery of Root Rat Cordell and Sam the Mole transformed into respect, then admiration, then requests for guidance. The man they'd dismissed as crazy proved to be the only one truly sane enough to recognize that the mightiest shelters grow from the earth rather than merely sitting upon it. And in that frozen winter of 1892, when 8 feet of snow collapsed 15 timber cabins but couldn't budge a single root of that ancient Douglas fir, Sam Cordell didn't just survive. He demonstrated the truth that architects and builders are still learning, that the strongest foundations aren't always the ones we pour ourselves, but the ones that have been growing, adapting, and strengthening for centuries, waiting for someone wise enough to build beneath their protection.